All right, good afternoon and welcome back to the 16th Annual CUNY Black Male Initiative Conference. We're so thrilled to be back with you for our Power Talk lunch today with Dr. Eddie Glaude Jr. Many of you have obviously been seeing the advertisements and the excitement that we have around having him as a guest. Yesterday was an amazing conversation with Lisa Evers. Today is an equally amazing conversation with Dr. Glaude. I'm going to tell you a little bit about who he is, and then we'll kind of jump into our conversation. Dr. Glaude, I'm going to keep it real and just like try to keep it as personal as possible. So I'll do the formal stuff first, but we'll get that out the way quick, all right? It's so good to have you here. So Dr. Glaude is an author, political commentator, public intellectual, and passionate educator who examines the complex dynamics of the American experience. His writings include Democracy in Black, How Race Still Enslaves the American Soul, and In a Shade of Blue, Pragmatism and the Politics of Black America. His most recent work, which we're going to reference a lot, this New York Times bestseller, Begin Again, James Baldwin, America, and its urgent lessons for our own, takes a wide look at Black communities, the difficulties of race in the United States, and the challenges we face as a democracy. In his writing and speaking, he is just all over the place. He's all over the world at this point. And he really has been acknowledged by Princeton University as a McDonald Distinguished University Professor and a chair of Department of African American Studies there at Princeton. He frequently appears in the media as a columnist for Time Magazine and as an MSNBC contributor on programs like Morning Joe and Deadline White House with Nicole Wallace. He's also on Meet the Press on Sundays. He's got so much of a great history, so I'm going to stop there for a little bit. I'll talk more about you a little bit later. At least I'm doing it in front of your face, not behind your back. So Dr. Glaude, how you doing today? Good to see you.
It's great to be with you, Shawn. It's so great to be a part of this conference, and I look forward to the conversation.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us. We have thousands of young Black and Latino men, as well as other students who are joining us, who are part of the CUNY Black Male Initiative family, also family members, parents, contributors, teachers, educators, so many that are watching online today. And so we're so thrilled to have you join us, especially because your background is a lot like some of our students. And so I'd love to just talk a little bit about just the way you were raised a little bit before we jump into some of the book questions and some of the mental health conversation we're going to have later. But just hearing your story through some YouTube videos I was watching, knowing that you're Mississippi born, raised in a Catholic church, your mom cleaned toilets, your dad delivered mail, and just how you grew up. Can you just tell me a little bit more about where did you get your vision for what your possible future could be? When did that begin to form for you that this could all be possible?
Wow, that's such a wonderful way to begin, to lift up my parents in some ways. I grew up in a working class household. My mom dropped out of high school in the 9th grade because she got pregnant. And my dad left home early to go to Vietnam. So in effect, my parents grew up with us. I'm the youngest of 4. My oldest sister, the one my mother, when in the 9th grade, my mother contracted what is called German measles back in the day. And so she's severely handicapped. And they only said that she was supposed to live till she was 8 years old. And she's now 50. She's 56, 57 years old.
Amazing.
So, but it's a testimony to my mother and father, But I grew up in a household where there wasn't, how can I put this? I'm thinking about it a lot now. There wasn't a lot of attention. There were just expectations. My father scared me to death. I was afraid of him. But he also instilled in me discipline, the expectation. He would say to me, I don't know what you're going to do after you turn 18, but you got to get the hell up out of here. And if you had any sense, you get the hell up out of this town. And so there was this kind of expectation that we would leave Moss Point, Mississippi. They didn't go to college. My sister was the first in our family to go off to college. She graduated valedictorian of our high school, and the first African-American to graduate as valedictorian in the high school then chose a second valedictorian, a white girl. So it happened with my sister in that sort of way. So, but it was a complicated childhood, like kind of mixed with unconditional love, disturbing silences, and fear. I'll say that, and fear. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's real. I appreciate that synopsis of your childhood, because when I talk to students and when our BMI directors talk to their students at the 33 different programs that we support across the CUNY system, a lot of times they are coming from complicated backgrounds and childhoods, and perhaps don't have a visual about what their future possibilities could be through education, because they've never been exposed to someone in their family that either went to college or had a chance to maybe sort of set the groundwork for them. However, yet that still expectation of excellence and achieving beyond what even my parents or their parents achieved is still set on them, right? And so I think about even the idea that I was called doctor by my father from the age of 3 years old, before I even ever thought about getting a doctorate. And actually now having one now, knowing that my family didn't have that legacy. So when I think about just your story and how it relates, you went to Morehouse at 16 years old, right? I think it was Morehouse you went to at 16.
Absolutely.
And that's incredible, right? So having that sort of that opening, what did education do for you in terms of creating the social and economic mobility that you wanted to see? How did education in Morehouse contribute to creating a new future?
Everything. I found a world in books beyond my father's anger, beyond the sense of being betwixt and between. I should say this, my father was the second African-American hired at the post office in Pascagoula, Mississippi. My mother worked for the janitorial services of Ingalls Shipyard. But because my father worked for the post office, we had basically a middle-class life. Because, back in the day, working for the post office meant stability across the board.
Stable, absolutely.
But my dad and my mom were not part of the Black bourgeoisie of my hometown. They weren't graduates of Tuskegee or Tougaloo or Jackson State or Southern, right? They didn't go to Mississippi State. They didn't go to USM, right? My dad was a notorious thug back in the day when he was in high school, right? And so here he had his children in this middle-class space, but we couldn't occupy it. We couldn't live in it. So we were betwixt and between. There were no books in my household, only the newspaper. The only thing he expected us to do, he would line us up. He would call us, I little N-words, line up. And we would have to come in and show him our report cards every single time. Why'd you get this B? What's this about? And when I remember when I was young, I still can't add or multiply. My dad, who's this working class dude, hired a tutor so I can learn my times table, right? So when I decided, but it was so intense, Shawn, I needed to get away. It was the psychological turmoil was such. I remember I had a blue typewriter in my room, and I remember starting my first book. At least I tried to. And it was on the difference between physical and psychological abuse is what I wanted to write about. And so I wanted to get away. And when I got an opportunity, my sister went off to Spelman to go to college after graduating from high school, because we had one of the counselors was a Spelman grad or had a connection to a Spelman grad. My sister came home and said, you too white. And we could talk about that later at another time.
Yeah.
And she said, you too white, you need to learn your history. Why don't you come to Morehouse? And I said, well, give me an application, I'll do it. So she gave me an application for the summer science program. Remember, I can't add. So I lied and said I wanted to be a doctor. I got to Morehouse and my world was just transformed. All the things that I'd imagined myself, I'd imagined being this expansive person beyond the place in which I lived. And then I come home, I'm in Morehouse, and I said, I don't want to go home. But I had enough self-regard, Shawn. I walked into the office of the then Dean of Admissions, Sterling Hudson, and I said, let me convince you to not send me home. And I walked out with a scholarship.
What?
Yeah, but then I had to go home and convince my dad to sign off on the paperwork.
Right.
And he told me, I know why you leave it. I know why you want to leave. But don't ever think you might not have to ask me for something.
Mm.
And then he said, let me think about it. Because he had to make sure that I was mature enough to leave. And then finally he made a bet on me. And the rest is history, I suppose.
Wow, that's incredible. That's incredible. Love that. It actually brings me back to a time where, similar to you in a way, I was trying to get into my master's program at NYU and had to convince my director to let me in with some coaxing, and so I'm so amazed. You mentioned that psychological and physical challenges when you began to start writing. And I had a question about that later on, but I kind of want to jump into it now because it is so related to the book, obviously, that you wrote, and also just about the challenges that come along with the psychological and mental challenges of aspiring to anything. And not only aspiring to education and the pursuits that come along with building your career, but also just thinking about how do we actually stay psychologically safe as Black men in a country that was not maybe designed for our best outcomes, right? So I want to just go right to the book a little bit, and then we'll kind of jump back and forth because I want to get back to that "you're too white" comment a little bit later too. Got to get into that a little bit, but there is a quote on page 122, and I'm going to just read a little bit of it. But when Baldwin was trying to write No Name, you talk about as he's trying to write this book, he's having these challenges, not only physically, but also having these challenges psychologically with working through what it meant to be an American, right? And so therefore he obviously moved out of America and began to renounce some things about it. But you write this statement that it began to be very clear to Black people in the United States that what Time Magazine calls the troubled American is not going to listen, does not want to know, does not want to hear the truth about the situation of the American Black. And one of the results of that is that everybody involved in it has to rethink his situation, rethink his strategy. And so as you go on further to talk about eventually, because of his writing and the letters that he wrote, he ended up actually creating an avenue for Angela Davis to begin to be freed from her incarceration situation, right? And so I want to just ask you the question of how would you describe the spirit behind, the indomitable spirit behind Baldwin's choice to struggle and write despite the psychological and physical perils that he faced? Because obviously we needed his work. But how would you describe that struggle? And what would you say that says about us as Black people sort of today?
Well, let's be very clear. Many of us would not be here if it wasn't for the resolve of those who experienced unimaginable brutality within the context of slavery. There are those who chose to live. I mean, you can read J.W.C. Pennington's The Fugitive Blacksmith, and you can see that he decides that he's going to run away, but he feels a sense of anguish because he's going to leave people he loves behind, right? And there are these choices that were made day in and day out to survive the ugliness of slavery, the brutality of Jim Crow, the horror of American racism, but to survive so that you could provide the conditions for the next generation to flourish. You survive so they can flourish. You make do, as my great grandmother used to say. You make do for the conditions, for the possibility for you to become what you've been called to be. So Baldwin understood growing up in intense poverty in Harlem. See, Baldwin isn't from Sugar Hill, where Du Bois and all those folk are from. He's not where Langston Hughes is from, right? Or where Langston Hughes was living. Baldwin is in the hood. He knows hunger. His father goes mad and dies of tuberculosis. He's trying to figure out how to feed his 8 brothers and sisters, trying to support his mother, but he has stories swirling around in his head. He knows that he has, right, this sense of what it means to be a writer that's in his spirit. And he knows that he has different desires, and he needs the space to be himself. So he does something in 1948, which is unimaginable, thinking he's from the hood in the most cosmopolitan city in the world. But he has to imagine himself in even more expansive terms. So he leaves. He says, he looks back in the price of the ticket. He said, I had to leave because in 1948, if I didn't leave, I was either going to kill some white person or some white folk were going to kill me. And it's in Paris that he dares to imagine himself as a writer. He dares to take the risk to become a writer. After King's assassination, though, he tries to commit suicide. Because even though he's engaged, Shawn, in this massive act of self-creation, he's still wounded.
Yeah.
He's still wounded by the sexual violence he experienced, more than likely in Greenwich Village. He's still wounded by the treatment he experienced from his father. He said, I never thought an ugly Black child like him could be loved. Mm. He thought he was loveless, even as he made himself into a writer of international reputation. He still carried with him, right, those broken pieces. Mm. You see? And so, we all got our mess.
Yeah.
That's in tow. We all have our mess that's in tow.
Absolutely. And one of the reasons why we focused on mental health as a theme for this year is because not only the last 17 months that have obviously ravished many of our communities and helped us realize and expose the disparities that still exist that were spoken about in the Baldwin era, but also just in general, how do you learn to live in a way that you can see and remember the trauma and yet still choose to persevere and thrive in those moments? A lot of our young people who are watching this are at the age where they are starting to realize that there may not be a Calvary coming. They may not be some sort of a beautiful rainbow on the other side. It could be just hard. And it gets harder as you get older and as you persevere. And I think about this phrase you talked about earlier in your book about how sometimes in eras like a pandemic or the George Floyd era that we obviously are kind of still living through, America might make a new policy and then there's this self-congratulatory pat on the back they do. But then we're still stuck with the same realities and same ghettos. It's funny, the same area you're talking about in Harlem. I live in Harlem across from Lenox Hospital. I'm right there in the middle. So as is my daily experience. And I look at some of my counterparts who might be living in a different economic stratosphere and they just don't see the same issues. They think things have changed because of new policies. Obviously, back in the 60s, it was civil rights, it was voting rights, it was whatever laws, economic act, the Economic Act. But today it's the new George Floyd rule or law against choking, or the Eric Garner rule against choking out. But yet still the cycles exist. And so I wonder if you can talk about that balance that we have to confront or deal with. And how do we deal with that? Living in those two realities of, we might have a policy that helps us in some ways outwardly, but still have these cycles of poverty and economic divide that exists with us in our daily experiences. How do we reconcile that mentally and begin to actually envision a new America?
Well, we can't reconcile it. We have to understand it for what it is. It's a contradiction, right? It is material evidence of the failure of the country to live up to the promise of American democracy. It should be the spur that motivates us to act, to build a better world. There's no way to reconcile, policies aimed at remedying X and practices that reproduce X. Mm-hmm. Right. So here you have a recent study out of the University of Washington in the Lancet, published it in the medical journal, talking about how police killings were undercounted have been undercounted, and that Black people were 3 times as likely to die at the hands of the police. This is just released just yesterday in the New York Times, covered in the New York Times. That's a lived reality. There's no way we're going to reconcile ourselves to that lived reality. We have to fight against it, right? Now, the question to me also asks, how does one imagine oneself in spite of it? How do you think of yourself in the grandest of terms, given the contradictory nature of the world in which we inhabit? How do you find the resources? Because, you know, what does Langston Hughes say? Life ain't been no crystal state.
Mhm.
So when you say, what does that mean? That means our lives are shot through with the fact that this place generally devalues Black life.
Mhm.
And it's in that context that we have to forge a self. Just think about it. We have to imagine ourselves in the most expansive of terms, in a place that generally devalues us. There's no reconciling that, Brother Shawn.
That's right.
So what we have generated over the course of our people's journey in this place is a sensibility that allows us to navigate it. It's that blues sensibility. You know, B.B. King, nobody loves me but my mother, and she could be jiving too. Right? There's a way in which we have managed that contradiction and created culture, music, a way of life that allows us to navigate it and still imagine excellence in the face of it all, if that makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. And what I'm inspired by and what you just said is the imagination, right? I feel like if you go through the annals of time, every generation of Black and brown groups of people in America had to almost create and imagine a way to exist in this world, and using different sectors of industry, whether it be media, entertainment, music, whatever, to create. And you talk about this idea of being Black is a pre-political state. You've mentioned this before, I believe, and it seems like in some ways you're touching on that a little bit now and thinking about how our natural state of who we are needs to be imagined with the possibilities of who we are before slavery, before any political ideologies or anything that's actually bestowed on us. And so I'm wondering if you can just expand a little bit on that idea of being Black is pre-political, what that means, and how that actually can play in our favor for how do we begin to dismantle potentially some of the existing structures that hold us down.
Well, let me kind of take it in a different direction, because I meant by pre-political actually a criticism. Let me show you what I mean. There is this presumption that the fact of our Blackness, right, defines your and my political outlook. So there's this presumption, because white folks see us, the country sees us as this undifferentiated group that can be treated as if there's no differences among us. And then we respond to that by assuming that the fact of our Blackness means that you and I stand in solidarity with each other by definition. And that makes us pre-political, right? That is as if politics doesn't enter in to how we move about the world. And when you do that, you actually set it up for selfish Black people to exploit Black people. You actually obscure class differences. You obscure patriarchy within our communities. You obscure homophobia within our communities, the way Black trans men and women experience life in our communities, because you just assume Black people as Black people gonna hold the same politics, period. And so part of what I'm trying to do when I say they view us as pre-political, I'm saying, no, we're not. We actually have to do politics, right? You just can't presume that because you're Black, we all hold the same views, because if you do that, you're gonna have some Black people pimping in the name of Blackness, doing damage in the name of Blackness. And then you presume that because they're Black, they're supposed to act in your interest. No, that's not necessarily the case. But I will say this in relation to the question that you asked. We have a grand tradition as the wind at our back. And understanding that tradition at its best offers all of us resources to imagine a way of being in the world that is, as Baldwin says, the spiritual aristocrats that this country produced. So that tradition, right, is the wind beneath our wings.
Mm-hmm.
It is the crown that has been placed above our heads. And you have to make a choice in how you live, whether or not you're going to live into that crown, grow into it, as it were.
Yes, that's beautiful. And I've heard you say that phrase a couple of times that relates to this, that all skin folk ain't kinfolk, right?
No, I mean, we know this even in our communities, right? Communities that we love. We know we got Black people that prey on Black people. We got Black people who are totally self-interested, who are selfish. I remember after the 2020 election, people would ask me, Shawn, how is it that all of these Black men voted for Donald Trump? And then I would say, white men don't have a monopoly on selfishness and greed.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So part of this has to do with these assumptions about who we are that flatten the complexity of who we are, you know, and we have to resist that at all costs.
Yes, absolutely. I want to shift gears a little bit and just talk a little bit about sort of mental health as in terms of like what it means for us as a community, for Black men, for Hispanic men who are also part of our community that we support primarily as well, and thinking about your own personal journey, right? And so, you know, I asked you before this conversation, is anything off limits? And you said, as long as, you're willing to talk about it, it's not off limits. So I'm gonna go a little deeper here and ask you just to think about, obviously, some of the mental health challenges that James Baldwin penned in the book and you referenced came from the human condition, right? Thinking about how you see yourself and holding those images and perceptions that you may be internalized, maybe at the same time that you're still experiencing success outwardly and people are applauding you and giving you the platform and the stage in this moment in your life, right? And so watching even your own progression as you're sort of ascending in a way in the minds of American people, especially the Black community, and how proud we are of you and your work. What relationship do you have personally with mental health strategies to make sure that you're on balance? And what do you do to infuse in your own life the right resources and tools to make sure you don't become the person that Baldwin talks about, who becomes selfishly ambitious and begins to be sort of wrapped up in the praise of those who are around you? What do you do personally to infuse mental health resources into your journey?
Well, I should say I should give a lot of credit to my son. You know, I'm a Southerner. I grew up in Mississippi, so I'm a Gen X guy, but mental health in the Black community in Mississippi is not something that is just readily talked about. Depression, stress, traumatic stress, we can go down the line. It's just not, we didn't have a language growing up.
Mm-hmm.
And I grew up with death, uncles committing suicide, right? Domestic violence that resulted in killing the wife and then killing himself. This is my family on my dad's side, the men, right, grappling with unemployment and alcoholism and the like, and what that meant for them. But we didn't have a language to describe what we were experiencing, what I saw. My son has been giving me language to help me understand the stressors that bring me to the edge, as it were. It is hard to lose the privacy of one's own life because you become, as Cornell would say, you give yourself over to your vocation. Cornell West, that is, you give yourself over to your vocation. Mm-hmm. You have to engage in this daily work of not believing what the world is telling you. Don't, as my mother would say, don't let it go to your head, And for me, we all inevitably lose our way. When you have all of this stuff coming at you, you inevitably will lose your way. The question is, do you have the capacity to recalibrate, to recenter? And the way in which I recenter all the time is by saying I'm Juanita's child. I'm my mama's baby. And so if I get too far into this thing, right, then I got something to keep me centered and focused. But in terms of self-care, I'm not very good at it. The best thing that I do in order to disengage is I will disappear into a novel. I will find some quiet space in my little man cave, turn on some jazz and read and drink myself some Irish whiskey. But sometimes when I'm really down, that alcohol can get a bit too much, right? But the idea is to figure out, you know, that cigar, that Irish whiskey, that novel, and that time, that quiet time where I'm not running my mouth, but I'm lost in another world. It gives me an occasion to replenish. Yeah. But I have to thank my son, who's now a young, who's been through so much. He's a first-year law student out at Berkeley, who's insisted on mental health playing a central role in how me and his mom and him, how we move forward. And that's a generational accomplishment, because that's not my dad. And that damn sure isn't my granddad. And it wasn't me, but my son, who's in the midst of this craziness, trying to come of age, is talking about mental health in this moment. It's just beautiful, actually.
That is very beautiful. And I do appreciate your transparency in that moment as well, because I mean, it is easy to present as I got it all together, but for your honesty and knowing we all have these moments where we try to fill the vacuum in our souls with self-medicative practices or things that can just, kind of take us away, right? To run away from whatever that vacuum is leading us toward, instead of leaning into those emotional places. And I think about this too, because even your writing, in some ways, I would consider it sort of an activism. It is activism. You are writing about things that are confronting America, confronting the dominant voice about who we are as a people, where do we go as a people, and how do we even just think about what dismantling some of these structures exist. And having that sort of activist pen that's always kind of, in your mind available, there has to be moments where I've seen many activists have to go through mental turmoil because they're constantly pouring out, right? And rarely being poured into, or rarely having those moments. So you having the history of being a chair of a Department of Religion and now chair of Black Studies, you talk about this connection between the Afro-Protestant religion, right? I heard one interviewer say to you spirituality, and you kind of just narrowed in on the focus of the Afro-Protestant sort of perspective, and activism, right? And how those two, they actually kind of are connected, they exist together. I'm wondering if you can share with us the connection between Afro-Protestant religion and activism, how those play a role with each other, and how that even contributes to again, the drainage, or if you want to say even potentially the enhancement of the Black American experience in this country. We'd just love to hear more about what you meant by that connection between the Afro-Protestant religion and activism, and how that plays a role. I don't know very many of my white counterparts and friends who are Catholic or Protestant in some ways, who often are participating in activist sort of traditions through their churches, their synagogues, their mosques, their whatever they're going to. But it seems like there's inevitable connection between what Afro-Protestant religious experiences are, and also activism. Can you talk about that connection a little bit?
Sure. I think, part of what I was trying to do, and relying on the work of Joseph Surratt at Columbia and others, is to kind of complicate the way in which we talk about African-American religion or the Black church. oftentimes what we really mean when we're talking about African-American religion or the Black churches, we're really referencing Afro-Protestantism. When we know that Black religious life is much more complicated. I was raised Catholic in the Josephite tradition on the coast of Mississippi. There are folk who are Baha'i, there are folk who are Muslim, right? So there Buddhism, there's Black Buddhism. But oftentimes when we talk about Black religion, what we're really talking about is Afro-Protestantism. And so I wanted to be more specific so that we give space for the broad religious diversity that's in our community. Now, thinking about Black Protestantism and Black activism reminds me of Du Bois's classic essay of the faith of the fathers in the souls of Black folk. And Baldwin makes this, Du Bois makes this extraordinary claim in that essay. He says, the Black church predates the Black family. Mm-hmm. And part of what he's saying is that Black churches, those Baptist and Methodist churches, were the kind of site for the beginnings of Black civil society, having everything to do with how, segregation, how white supremacy, right, divided Black and white. When you think about the Civil War happened in America before the first shell was fired at Fort Sumter. It happened in American Christendom. That's why you have Methodist North and Methodist South. It happened over the issue of slavery, Black folk leaving white churches precisely because of the issue of racism. You had to go into the Negro pews. You had to take communion after all the white people took communion. We weren't even allowed to be buried in the church cemetery. So what do we get, right? We get Black folk pulling out of those churches, starting their own denominations in the North in particular, the invisible institution in the South. After the Civil War, the African Methodist Episcopal Church coming down South, engaging in a whole, decades of proselytizing and a kind of great awakening that led to massive conversions and the like. That institutional space became the space for Black politics and activism. If Black churches are the soil for Black civil society, it also offered the languages for Black politics. Black preachers oftentimes were Black political leaders. So there's this intimate and intricate relationship between the two, although they're not reducible to each other. Because as Max Weber would say, as communities begin to get more sophisticated, you begin to see differentiation, right? At one point, there's the church and everything within it. Another point, the church is standing alongside of educational institutions, popular entertainment institutions, right? We begin to see that differentiation as Black communities get more complicated and stratified.
Yeah, love that. That's real. It's funny because I think one of my most memorable experiences growing up with a dad who was a pastor was having political leaders often come in and speak and listening to the cadence even of those speakers and being like, I feel like I just got 2 sermons today, right? And so understanding that there is such a foundation through the Black church that is super powerful. You talk about this idea, right, just now about how, the Black church, that became not only a foundation, but that was also one of the first places where we had our own, we had our own ownership over our own intellectual property, our own sort of buildings, our own space, our own ownership, our own LLCs or whatever the business might have been called as a church. And so I'm just also, there's a question that I had with one of my teammates where we were talking about what we were going to discuss with you today. And he had this question about just, what does it look like for us to have our own? And is that the key to actually having more ownership in our country and having more ability to dismantle some of the white sort of supremacist structures that do keep us separated and then keep us from having access? Is that philosophy where you hear people say, well, if we had our own, we could hire our own? Is that a path forward as a philosophy for economic community development, for access to resources, for collective power for the Black community? Just doing our own, starting our own, and then just building our own? Is that the way we should go forward? I'm curious about your perspective on it.
It all depends on the actual philosophy of the persons who are engaging in this. So, I mean, look, trickle down economics in the hands of Ronald Reagan and Republicans, all too often, that particular political economic ideology is viewed by most of us as bad. The idea that we need to give to the rich and then, or make it easier for the rich to gain capital, and then that will trickle down to the rest of the folk. Oftentimes, when we think of Black ownership, we're using a trickle down model. The only thing we need to do is have more Black millionaires, more Black Oprahs and Robert Johnsons, and somehow that's going to make the Black community better. Why? You think it's going to trickle down? Because we're going to have, why? Do you think by virtue of the fact that these folk are Black, that this money is going to make its way to poor communities in New York City or in the Delta of Mississippi? Not necessarily. So part of what we have to do is to understand the economic system that produces this differentiation between those who have and those who do not have. So on the one hand, ownership matters, right? But it could be very much more interesting if it's communally owned.
Yeah.
As opposed to creating the conditions under which you have a Black business class that's exploiting Black poor people, as opposed to a white business class exploiting Black and brown people. So part of what I would want to insist upon as we have that kind of conversation is to get a sense of what's the actual motivation behind it. Because if I think trickle down economics is bad on that side of town, I probably think it's bad on our side too.
Yeah, you're preaching. It's interesting in some of the work I do outside of CUNY as well. I think about how companies are constantly hiring the trophy Negro, the one Black person who's now overseeing, whether it be diversity operations or any DEI efforts, and then we somehow think that translates to sort of this trickle down effect even in hiring. That's just not the reality. It's still not the case. And you nailed it. I'm encouraging audience members to go ahead and use the form stack that we sent to you to submit some questions. We already have a few questions here in the chat, so I'm going to pivot to some of them now, and then we'll kind of keep the conversation going. So a couple of questions are geared around Obama's impact on our ability to push forward Black and brown economic mobility in this country. And also, even there's one here I'm going to probably focus on first, which is about the LGBTQ rights. So I'm just going to read it, and then we can kind of decipher it. So how much more did the Obama's presidency LGBTQ plus rights push? I'm sorry, let me read that again. So how much more did the Obama presidency's LGBTQ rights push intensify the socio-political climate we are in today? And it says also as a follow-up, was it the gasoline that fueled a conservative coalition that included 13% of African-American men? And they're wondering if that actually perhaps swung their election kind of in this world.
I don't think so. I don't think it was necessarily the Obama administration's LGBTQI policies that intensified the culture wars. Because I think this is the essence of the question. I think Obama's election, period, intensified the culture wars. Obama's election made concrete the political consequences of demographic shifts that were happening across the country, and sheer panic, right, was the response. So remember, Obama gets elected. First thing you see is the gutting of the Voting Rights Act with the Shelby decision. Then voter suppression laws across the country. He hasn't even had a time to shoot to put the lights up on the White House. The gay pride colors haven't hit the White House yet, but we already see a response. You get the vitriol of the Tea Party, right? Talking about those AstroTurf protests of ACA or the Obamacare, and we all knew that underneath the Tea Party was this ugly nativism, this ugly racism that eventually vomited up Donald Trump. So I don't think it was simply the LGBTQI policy position. The culture wars, this version of it aims to exploit people's hatreds for political aims and ends, to exploit the cultural shifts that are happening in the country, because the other side doesn't really have policy responses to what's happened in the country. Because in fact, COVID has revealed that the political ideology of the last 40 years that has governed the country, that ideology is bankrupt. So I don't want to say, and I understand the question in terms of LGBTQ issues vis-a-vis Black communities that are oftentimes really conservative vis-a-vis those issues, could push particularly some Black men, particularly Black evangelical men to the right. Perhaps, I think more than anything, there's a kind of selfishness and greed and a kind of cultural conservatism that defines it as well. But I don't think that's at the center of the shift. The center of the shift is, what the hell is this country coming to if they can elect a Black man and put these Black folk in the White House? We need to figure out how to nip this in the bud now.
Yeah.
So what does that mean? Disenfranchisement. It means revisiting, intensifying the immigration debate. It means intensifying this kind of cultural question around history and the like. And that's what we're living through right now.
Yeah. It's actually scary to think about, even the article you referenced earlier about the underreporting of the killing of Black men for so long. It's scary to think about some of the things that are happening now in the Midwest with the abduction of a lot of Black and brown people silently happening, people getting brought out to the Midwest and then all of a sudden disappearing. And we're seeing these disappearing stories happening in Arizona and North Dakota and all these Midwest places, and what the secret sort of behaviors that are happening now that are not as publicized anymore because of the pandemic, and that's not really maybe even hearing about this or seeing this happen. And so we see that assault on Black and brown communities that still exists, that is just under an undercurrent consistently throughout our communities. And there's another question here I want to ask related to that. And as you were talking a little bit earlier about the underreporting, and sort of also even just your background with having the religion and being a chair of the Department of Religion and knowing what the connections are between being Black and religious. The question here is, how important can the role of spiritual and religious enhancement play into us being able to combat the actual political forces and the sort of infuse in us, I guess, the mental health resources that we need? And so I think the question in essence is saying, can spirituality help improve our mental health states, and how so?
It can, but there's no guarantee. I mean, one of the things you have to remember is that as January 6th was happening, people were praying. You don't remember all of those preachers with their hands on Donald Trump, right? All of those preachers with their praying on Donald Trump. So we know that there's always been this intimate relationship between a certain kind of Christian witness and the sanctification of power. Frederick Douglass would say that, the church steeple was right next to the slave auction block. So there's no necessary relationship between a set of religious commitments or a deep spirituality and a politics that actually reflects a concern for the least of these. There's no necessary relationship between those two. Baldwin in The Fire Next Time is, he has that wonderful line as he transitions from one part of Down at the Cross to the other. He says, if the concept of God doesn't make us more expansive and more loving, then it's time we got rid of it. Right. So part of what I'm saying, it all depends on what is the content of that spiritual message. Because we have right now a theology, we can call it a prosperity gospel, that is so assimilable to the greed and selfishness of this current moment. It's almost a theology for the darkness of the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to be very, very careful in how we think about this stuff.
Sure, sure. I'm going to take it to sort of a last question before we begin to just ask you to share any projects you're working on or anything that's on your mind going forward, to point us to some good resources. But there is a quote you have from you about how you constantly challenge us and then challenge the collective American conscious, not to posit the greatness of America, but to establish the ground upon which to imagine the country anew. And a lot of times when you are, giving your thoughts and your reflections on the narrative of our American society and our current state of the world, you often have said the word "we" need to imagine, we need to, correct, we need to. We failed to live up to the promise of American promise. You even said during this conversation, right? And so just thinking about this idea of we, right? Where would you say the we applies in the conversation about imagining a country anew? Who's responsible? Who's in that we? And when is it we and sometimes just me or they? How do you apply that word when you think about reimagining a country anew?
What I am very purposeful and deliberate in the way in which I use we. Sometimes when I use we, I'm referring to just simply Black people. Sometimes when I use we, I'm just referring to those who hold similar ideological commitments or political commitments. Other times when I use we, it's aspirational. It's a sense of who I hope we can be as a country, as a people, as a nation. And it's deliberately ambiguous in these moments because I want us to ask the question, who's this we? Because that's precisely the question we need to be asking ourselves. Mm-hmm. Who's the we who's going to fight for the New Jerusalem? Who's the we that's going to fight for a new America? Who's the we that's going to fight for the least of these, right? Or am I in that we? What's my relationship to it? Who's the we that's going to fight for a more just world? And to my mind, I'm always trying in my work, Shawn, to call that we into being, to call that we to attention, right? And sometimes it requires implicating myself in the mess, although I'm often the object of the mess. Mm-hmm. You see? So we all have a responsibility in this country, white, Black, brown, green, purple, yellow, all of us, to try to imagine a genuinely multiracial democracy, to try to bring that into existence. That's going to require all of us to fight against white supremacy, to fight against the greed and the utter stupidity that threaten to kill, that threaten to destroy this republic. All of us have to do that. Mm-hmm. Some of us come out of different traditions to do it. Some of us have different experiences that are the wind, that's the wind at our backs, but all of us have to do it. All of us at the end of the day.
It's fantastic. Well, I think that's a perfect place to wrap up for today. And I think you have really explained and shared personally, professionally, spiritually, on all the different levels that we actually are needing to hear about. And so thank you for taking the time to be with us and to really be transparent about what this journey has been like for you and what we can learn from the history and the lessons of James Baldwin's story as well. And we obviously are supporting. We're going to be buying some of the books that you've written so that we can share with our BMI community. And I'd love to just the people to know from you directly, where can they find more about your work, and where can they hear you preach on a Sunday? And, what are the things that you're doing now that we'd love to hear about? What are you working on? What's on your mind?
Well, I don't preach on Sundays regularly, but, I speak around the country. Follow me on Twitter at @ESGlaude. You can find my work on the website at Princeton, laying out all the stuff that I do. I'm in the middle right now of starting the sequel to Begin Again, not so much about James Baldwin, but about our moment, trying to think about grief, mourning, the trauma, and how that shapes our political choices in the current moment. So I'm in the midst of writing that book, working on that book. And of course, I'm reading novels. I'm still reading novels. I would recommend everyone grab a hold of Honore Jeffers' new book, The Love Songs.
Bring that closer. Bring that closer.
The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois.
Ah.
It's a wonderful novel, but hey, it's gonna take you a minute to finish it. It's kind of thick. It's kind of thick.
Noted.
If you can't get a hold of Honore's novel, grab a hold of a Jessamine Ward's beautiful novel, Sing Unburied Sing. It'll allow you to step outside of this crazy world and replenish. Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Glaude, thank you so much. Keep listening to your son. He's got some nuggets there too. And, I remember having those conversations with my dad a while ago, and they didn't go so well. So I'm encouraged to hear that you are in that space. Appreciate you so much. We'll be in touch. And this CUNY BMI community really appreciates the work that you're doing. It echoes around the universe, the academic universe. And we're going to just obviously share this with you when we're done and have it edited so that we can see it back and replay. So thank you so much. We'll be in touch. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Absolutely. Take care. Awesome. All right. And for those who are still watching on with us, we appreciate that time with Dr. Glaude. He is obviously a cauldron of information, a wealth of information that he's been sharing with us. And so we're excited that we can actually bring this to you in replay. Hope that you share it with your CUNY BMI communities and beyond. For all those who are watching across the country, share this with your students. Let them hear the personal, professional, spiritual journey that he is on and that he's taken us with to begin again and to imagine America anew. So we're encouraged. Our next panel starts in about 18 minutes. So you got some time to get a bite of eat or some tea and something to energize you for the afternoon. Please come back and join us for our last panel for the 16th annual CUNY BMI conversation that we're having today. We're so thrilled you've been with us all day long. And when we see you in about 15 minutes, you're going to be encouraged to hear from some more of our brilliant and brightest students at the CUNY system. Thank you for being here, and we'll see you in about a few minutes. All right, take care. Talk to you soon.